The speed and the ability with which I was able to speak improved dramatically after I made that decision. How do I stop translating in my head from English? All I want to be able to do is simply think in Spanish and express myself in Spanish. What's up, language leaders? Welcome back to another video. My name is Erica, here to help you live a new language. If you are interested in language learning and you have not yet subscribed, what are you waiting for? Subscribe and hit that notification bell and join this growing family. So, translation. This is a big topic, and as a person who both used translation as a tool to learn Spanish to fluency and then proceeded to work as a professional interpreter and translator, I have a lot to say on this topic. This is a question that I do get a lot, and some of you even describe it as your biggest struggle, that you feel like you have to think in English first before you then translate that into Spanish and are able to speak. So I want you to know that the answer to this question of how to think in Spanish or any other language, or how to stop translating from your native language, is going to be different for different people because it depends on where you are in your language learning journey. So I'll explain that a little while later. But first, I want you to know that translation in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it can be used as a tool. A common conception is that translation is this evil thing that gets into the way of our learning of our new language, and that if we get used to translating everything, then eventually we're going to just have to filter everything through English. We're never going to be able to break that habit. Children don't translate, they just learn. Well, that's because children often don't know any other language. They're learning to speak for the first time. So while I am all for learning as close as possible to the way small children learn, I also feel like we need to play up our strengths as adults. And one of the strengths that we have as adults is that we do already speak at least one other language. And as adults, we are aware that languages have patterns, they have structures. As adults, we have the ability to compare things and to find the similarities and the differences, and that helps us learn. It's kind of fun, actually. It's kind of like a game, if you're nerdy like I am anyway. So, especially if you're a beginner, do not be afraid of translation. You really can use it as a helpful tool to learn a language. I've mentioned many times before that I am a big fan of bilingual text. I really like to have a good translation. I'm not referring to using Google Translate, but having a good translation, whether that means that you're using a system like Asimil, which is a really good system, or if you found other resources that are translated well, or even if you take a material that's interesting to you that you found or that you've made yourself and you have that translated by someone. I love that. Having two things to compare is really helpful. First of all, because it helps us learn new vocabulary quickly. It's not really reasonable to expect that we can efficiently learn all of our new words in our target language through our target language only. Yes, oftentimes we are able to deduce the meanings of words, or we can use a dictionary in our target language, but that's when we're at a little bit more of an advanced level. So when we take translation out of the picture entirely, that whole group of beginners really get left out because translation is such a good tool in the beginning. The thing is, when you compare line by line a good translation of a written text, you start to notice patterns. You start to notice the structure of the language. You very quickly realize that languages can't be translated word for word. If only it were that easy, right? You start to see how an idea is expressed in another language. Languages are not really about words, they're about ideas. So when you take it a step further and you begin to translate on your own, then you start to practice the art of transmitting your idea of what you want to say into another language. So in a very counterintuitive way, the act of translating your thoughts, your ideas, or even someone else's thoughts and ideas that are on paper into another language, and doing that regularly is what's going to help you learn how to transmit your ideas into another language, and then be able to do that quite naturally without the need for translation. I mean, the reality is, once you find yourself needing to transmit the same thought over and over again, you're no longer going to have to think in your native tongue. Let's just call it English for the sake of this video. You're no longer going to have to think in English in order to transmit that idea. You're so used to doing it naturally now in the other language. So this is a very extensive topic that I'll surely be making other videos on. So again, don't forget to hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. But I did just want to clarify for you that you don't have to run away from translation, especially in the beginning. You really should embrace it. But let's talk about some situations where you do want to get over always having English in the mix. Now, if you feel like you are past the beginner stage, you understand quite a bit of Spanish, let's say, you understand when people speak to you, you have a pretty extensive vocabulary, and you feel like if you had a piece of paper in front of you, you could easily transmit your thought on paper, but when it comes crunch time, when it comes time to speak, immediately, quickly, you feel like you're just too slow because you're translating in your head from English. Okay, so if you're having that issue, then I do have a few tips for you. The first one would be to make sure you're getting enough input. Hear the language spoken in its natural habitat as often as you can. Observe the way people express themselves. Pay attention to those idioms, those set expressions that are impossible to translate word for word into another language because they would make no sense, but they are what they are. Learn those and begin to include them in your everyday speech. Number 2, talk to yourself. Self-talk is a wonderful way to practice your language, and it doesn't even take any additional time because you're going about your day, you're going about your business, you're simply talking to yourself, having conversations with yourself in your target language, and so you're practicing how to express ideas into the other language. My third tip would be to decide to think in your target language. This seems oversimplified, it's kind of like, well, sure, I'd love to be able to think in Spanish. But honestly, I remember so clearly one day when I said, I'm gonna think in Spanish. I wanna think in Spanish, so that's just what I'm gonna do. So I just made this active decision. And of course, that first day was hard. I would literally have to translate from English or just think really hard because I wasn't used to thinking in Spanish. But eventually it became second nature. That's when I started dreaming in Spanish, and my speech improved so much. The speed and the ability with which I was able to speak improved dramatically after I made that decision to start thinking in Spanish. So just do it. This is obviously going to be harder if you're just beginning with the language. So at that beginning stage, translate, use your bilingual text, and figure out how things are expressed in the other language. And then as soon as you can, start practicing by talking to yourself regularly and by making the active decision to think in your target language. And it will happen in time. When I was learning Spanish, after I had learned quite a bit, I had quite a bit of vocabulary and quite a bit of practice with the language, I would find myself automatically, whether in my head or out loud, interpreting in this case, because interpreting is the oral transmission of language, whereas translating is translating a written document. So I would find myself interpreting what I would hear just automatically. I'll be watching TV and just interpreting, how I would say that in Spanish. I don't know why I would do this, but I'm really glad that I did. And it may even have contributed to the fact that later when I started working as an interpreter, as a medical interpreter for English and Spanish, although we usually had to do consecutive interpreting, so the doctor or the patient would speak, pause, and then we interpret into the other language. Sometimes situations required that we do simultaneous interpreting, similar to what a conference interpreter would do. And I was really quite comfortable with that under most circumstances, whereas many of my colleagues would shy away from that and wouldn't want to interpret simultaneously because it is quite a difficult thing to do. It's possible that all of that practice that I had with just interpreting, and translating on paper as well as I was learning the language helped me out in that skill as well. I apply these same techniques right now to French many years later, and they still work. So in conclusion, use translation to your advantage. But if you're at an intermediate stage and you feel like you're still relying on it too much, make sure you're getting lots of input, practice talking to yourself often, all throughout the day, and make the active decision to think in your target language. Interestingly enough, in my 10-step plan to learning fluent Spanish, translation is one of those steps. So definitely download your free copy of the Spanish Fluency Blueprint and get started with a highly effective study plan today. And tell me in the comments below, have you used translation as a tool to learn a new language? I would love to hear your experiences. Please like this video if you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you did like this video, then you'll definitely like these other ones that give you additional tips of how to improve your conversational skills in another language, as well as showing you what I learned about vocabulary acquisition and retention in a foreign language from my 6 years working as an interpreter. Thanks for being with me today, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.